Hey there, Matter of Opinion listeners, it's Ross. The Matter of Opinion gang is taking a break from our regular programming this week to celebrate the 4th of July. But we didn't want to leave you in the dark during this chaotic, fascinating, wild moment of the presidential race, as the pressure on Joe Biden to drop out heats up. For now, Joe Biden is still in the race, but with his candidacy very much in question, some of my colleagues and I picked who we'd like to see run as the Democratic nominee. And you may hear some familiar voices making their picks.
I'm Lydia Polgreen, opinion columnist for the New York Times. Like many of my colleagues, I think it's time for Joe Biden to bow out, and I believe that the best person to replace him is Kamala Harris. You know, Kamala Harris, she didn't make it that far in the primaries, and that might make you think, this is someone who has tried and failed to become president. Why would she be good on the national stage? But I think it's important to remember that running in a primary and running for the general election are actually two very different things. In a primary, you're essentially running against your peers, in many cases, your fellow politicians from your party, and you're arguing with them over smaller differences than the big differences that separate our politics in this very polarized time, and where gender and race actually play a huge role in terms of how people are perceived, and where, you know, the showing of emotion or anger or other feelings play very differently depending on whether you're a woman, depending on whether you're a person of color. That primary environment, I think, is actually quite complicated. Those same dynamics can be at play in a general election as well, but they're actually much different in this particular general election, right? Because Donald Trump is a very particular kind of politician. I think one of the things that makes Kamala Harris really compelling in this environment is that we're dealing with a bully. And she is a person who I think does very well in going up against bullies. She has a demeanor, she has a way of speaking that I think very much comes from her experience as a prosecutor, that I think plays very well when dealing with someone who really is kind of outside the bounds of the law. One of the things that was most troubling about the debate between Biden and Trump was that, unsurprisingly, Trump just spouted lie after lie after lie. And the thing that was so devastating was that Joe Biden just seemed completely unable to counter those lies. And it's just impossible to imagine that Kamala Harris, who is really a very successful debater, wouldn't be able to just methodically come in and counter, point for point, every single thing that came out of Donald Trump's mouth. The Biden administration has put Kamala Harris front and center on the messaging about abortion rights, and rightfully so. Everyone knows that Joe Biden is not a great messenger on this issue. He has had a long history of ambivalence about choice. He is a devout Catholic, and I think it's fair to say he does not feel particularly comfortable speaking in strident terms about a woman's right to choose. That is not a problem for Kamala Harris. She is a lifelong believer and fighter for this cause, and I think would be an eloquent and powerful spokesperson for the issue as the nominee, just as she has been on the campaign trail as part of the ticket. There are really two separate questions we need to ask ourselves. One question is, would Harris be a good nominee? I feel, based on what we've seen in the past week, that actually she can make a pretty compelling case for herself as a strong candidate. I think there's another question, which is, would she make a good president? And in an abstract world where we weren't weighing her against Donald Trump, I think that's an interesting conversation to have. One of the criticisms of her when she was a primary candidate was that there wasn't a clear and compelling reason that she could give for why she should be president. What was her vision? And I don't think that she solved that problem. But I think it's important to remember that circumstances dictate who the right person is at any given time, right? And what is the need of the hour? The need of the hour is to somehow find a way to ease Joe Biden out of the presidency, somehow find somebody to take on Donald Trump. And so for me, the case for Kamala Harris is that she is the right person for that first part of the job, which is, frankly, the most important part of the job. This is an existential crisis. We cannot survive another Trump administration. Preventing Trump from winning the presidency, I think, has to be the paramount goal. I'm not saying that I don't think that Kamala Harris wouldn't be a good president. She might very well be a great president. I have no idea. But I don't think that that's a question that we frankly have the luxury to ask right now, because we know that Donald Trump would be a catastrophic president. In order to have a vacancy, in order to have an opportunity to run another candidate, President Biden has to decide not to run. And that ultimately is his decision to make. And it's going to be an excruciating and very hard decision. And to me, part of the reason that anointing Kamala Harris, who is his vice president, is an easier thing to do than simply throwing it open to a, for example, brokered convention, is that this is a natural order of things. You know, you choose a vice president because you might not live through your entire term. That's true of any president. And so I think it would be easier and less damaging for the party for President Biden to simply say, you know what? I think my time is up. It's time for me to pass the baton to the person you, the voters, voted into office as part of my administration to carry us forward.
I'm Nicholas Kristof, and I'm here with the case for Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. I'm rooting for Whitmer because the job at the nominee, and especially at a time when the stakes are so high, when Donald Trump is the opposition, the job of the nominee is to win. I do think that Governor Whitmer is particularly well-placed to get votes in the handful of states that are in play. For starters, Michigan is an absolute must-win state for the Democrats, and Whitmer has won it handily in both her races for governor. That suggests that she will also do well in nearby states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And I think her pragmatism will also play well with centrists in states like Arizona and Georgia. I think a Michigan governor is well-positioned to ride the anti-incumbent, anti-elitist mood that we see among voters in the U.S., and also just to generate excitement as a fresh face on the national scene, somebody from a new generation. And boy, I would just relish seeing how a dynamic younger candidate can force Trump on his heels and make him defend himself as the old guy with dubious mental acuity left in the race. I've been following Whitmer ever since she was a state senator, and in 2013 gave just an extraordinary speech for abortion rights that put her on the national map.
I rise for my no vote explanation. As the Republican male majority continues to ignorantly and unnecessarily weigh in on important women's health issues that they know nothing about.
Toward the end of that speech, she put down her notes and disclosed something that she had hidden from most people that was intensely personal.
But over 20 years ago, I was a victim of rape. And thank God it didn't result in a pregnancy. Because I can't imagine going through what I went through and then having to consider what to do about an unwanted pregnancy from an attacker.
She was emotional, raw, powerful, and persuasive. And that speech marked her as a politician to watch. Look, there are lots of uncertainties ahead. I have no idea what Whitmer's foreign policy would be, but I do know that she's a good speaker, that she has shown she can win over centrist voters, and also that she was only 1 year old when Biden was elected to the Senate. So, in my view, Gretchen Whitmer is the best Biden alternative. Keep an eye on her.
I'm Ross Douthat, and I'm a columnist for the New York Times. I'm here to make the case that the Democrats should nominate the senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin. much of the Democratic Party and many of my friends in the media are convinced that this election has almost existential stakes for the United States of America. And if that is the case, there is a reasonable argument for the Democratic Party to nominate someone who is as close to the center of American politics as you can get with a long record of voting for Democratic causes. So, Manchin 2024. Now, I've thought Joe Manchin should run for president for a while. In 2023, I made the case that he should run as an independent. And I thought, as a moderate Democrat, Manchin was well-positioned to run, basically, I argued, a kind of test the waters campaign. But the reason to think of him as a plausible third-party candidate is also the reason to think of him as a plausible nominee for the Democrats if their absolute goal is to defeat Donald Trump, no matter what. Manchin is a guy who successfully managed to get elected to the Senate from West Virginia over the course of multiple election cycles where West Virginia was being transformed from a reliably Democratic state into a reliably Republican one. And his strategy always seemed to be pull a given piece of Democratic legislation more towards the middle, or towards the middle as he understood it, but be willing to vote for it when push came to shove. He was, more socially conservative in various ways on issues ranging from abortion to immigration. He tended to be more skeptical of large spending bills of all kinds, climate change legislation in particular. He did a lot of things, especially in the Biden era, that made more ideological Democrats incredibly frustrated with him. At the same time, he remained a pretty reliable vote for Democratic causes and programs and judicial nominations and everything else. So in imagining him as a Democratic nominee, you're picking someone who, in a different kind of era, would have been the leader of probably a pretty big centrist faction in the Democratic Party. So nominating him wouldn't require the Democratic Party to radically shift its positions on almost any issue. It would be a unique signal to the country that the Democrats are willing to make major ideological compromise, which is the kind of signal that if you are determined to win the election at all costs, you want to be sending. I think Manchin's biggest challenge in the incredibly unlikely event that he was the Democratic nominee is that because he is a moderate who is despised by key activist groups in the Democratic coalition, that most Democrats are just not going to turn out for someone who spent the Biden years trying to make Joe Biden's agenda more moderate and sometimes contributing to derailing it. That's always the problem with trying to nominate the most moderate candidate. You risk alienating your own base. But I think in this scenario, given the lateness of the hour and Donald Trump as the Republican nominee, that what you would gain among swing voters would outweigh what you would lose in the party's base. Both political parties have nominated candidates for president who are broadly unacceptable to the middle 30% of Americans. And it would probably be useful for the country if one of the two parties tried to nominate someone who was much more acceptable to Americans in that middle ground.
I'm Pamela Paul, an opinion columnist for the New York Times, and I'm here to make the case for Wes Moore as the Democratic candidate for president. Wes Moore is the first-term governor of the state of Maryland, so relatively inexperienced in politics, but with a broad range of experience before coming to politics. He has served in the military, including serving at war in Afghanistan. He's worked in the private sector, in investment banking. He has foreign policy experience and expertise, and he's published 5 books, including books for young people. So I've been aware of Wes Moore for a long time as the former editor of the Book Review, as an author, and that's how I often thought about him. And I first met him out at Stanford University, where he was participating in a conference about revitalizing American institutions. And he and Governor Chris Sununu, Republican of New Hampshire, did a panel together in which they had a really lively, interesting conversation.
I'm absolutely honored to be here and to be with Wes, who I consider a great friend. He's a great governor.
And the thing that struck me most about their conversation is that they were friends, even though they are from very different sides of the political spectrum. Chris Sununu, as the more experienced governor, has given advice to Wes Moore, and Wes Moore called him his best advisor as a governor.
When I think about who some of the governors who have been most helpful to me as I made the transition, because I'd never run for office before I became the governor. And, people can think about, it's this governor or that governor or which political party. The reality is you've been one of the most helpful governors to me in this transition, and that's a Republican governor.
I thought that was remarkable because, as we all know, we live in a hyper-partisan time, and something that really came out in their conversation was that as governors, you need to get things done. You need to balance a budget. You cannot just not vote. You cannot just slide by. It's not like the Senate. And one of the reasons I think that Governor Moore is one of the best equipped people to assume the presidency is that as a governor, he has better experience than many people who have served in Washington for a long time. I think his relative youth could shake up a campaign that no one is happy with between two geriatric candidates. He could energize the electorate. I think that he could win and govern well, and he could really usher in a new era of leadership for Democrats. I mean, how have we gotten into a situation where we have an 81-year-old man who's been in politics his entire life as being our candidate when it's clear that Americans are not happy with how things are going and with the current direction of this country? The number one thing people will say about Wes Moore is that he doesn't have the experience necessary, that it's not his time yet. But first of all, I feel very frustrated with the it's his time or it's not his time thinking. Because when Biden was running, everyone thought, it's his time, he deserves it. When Bob Dole was running, it's his turn, he deserves it. This is a way to lose a campaign. This is not about making someone feel better. This is about what's doing right for the country. And Wes Moore, though he may not have a lot of governmental experience, he certainly had a lot more experience than Donald Trump did coming on. And in fact, I think his relative inexperience would work in his favor because people are looking for someone to bring a new perspective, who is not afraid of change, who can draw from a wide range of experience outside of Washington, and who's shown that he knows how to solve problems and lead.
I'm David French, and I'm here to make the case that Josh Shapiro should replace Joe Biden on the top of the Democratic ticket. Until 2016, I was a Republican. I'm still conservative. I'm a conservative in the Reagan conservative mold. So it is very unusual for me to be giving any kind of advice to the Democratic Party. However, I am of the belief that Donald Trump needs to lose in 2024 for the health of the country, for the health of our Constitution, and for the health, honestly, of the Republican Party and the conservative movement. And so I want to see the best possible Democrat face Donald Trump in 2024. Josh Shapiro is the first-term governor of Pennsylvania, former attorney general of Pennsylvania, and before then was a member of the state house of Pennsylvania. I think there are multiple reasons why Josh Shapiro would be a very good pick. And we can start with ideology, we can go to temperament, and then we can end with location. So ideology. Josh Shapiro is a more moderate or centrist Democrat. There are a number of initiatives, for example, in the state of Pennsylvania that he has broken with his party, at least to some degree, on to kind of move towards the center. For example, he has advocated for lowering corporate tax rates in Pennsylvania, the kinds of things that Republican voters would either appreciate or at least see that this person is not an ideological extremist, somebody who's willing to reach out across the aisle. He's somebody who ideologically is much closer to the exact kinds of voters who helped give Joe Biden the presidency in 2020. A lot of these suburban voters and college-educated women and others who, many of whom had voted Republican in the past. He seems to be much more in line with the bulk of the American people than somebody who's more on the left side of the Democratic Party. And then let's talk about the really important aspect of temperament. This is a guy who really, by and large, has a pretty measured tone, an ideal way of confronting someone like Donald Trump, who really needs to be meticulously rebutted in all of his falsehoods, dismantling these wild statements that Donald Trump has made, and doing so in a calm and measured way, I think is exactly what the doctor ordered for the public square. It would in many ways be a restoration of the way we think about the presidency, that we're not just electing a vehicle for an agenda, but a human being that we could actually have a degree of trust in. And then finally, he has the advantage of location, 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 the three most important things in real estate. He's a popular governor in a key swing state. This is perhaps the key swing state in the 2024 election. And this is something that's really important, not just for the sake of Pennsylvania, but other swing states. I think there's some real possibility there that he's actually a good cultural fit for some of these swing states. There's one other thing I didn't mention. He's relatively young. He's born in 1973. He's a Gen Xer. And this contrast between a Gen X candidate who's reasonable, who's sober, who's sharp as a tack, against a 70-year-old man who physically is able to sort of cover up his decline, but cognitively is capable of the exact kinds of word salads that we saw come out of Joe Biden's mouth in the debate. The contrast, I believe, would be very real and very obvious, and exactly the kind of contrast that the American people are looking for. And so these are all things that I think speak strongly in his favor, but I'm not going to pretend that it's just a no-brainer of a decision. There are also some downsides that come with Josh Shapiro. Nothing major or glaring, but there's two right away that you can think of. One, he's a first-term governor. I mean, he's not had a complete term as a governor. And so there would be some questions about experience. And then also, it has to be acknowledged that nobody knows who he is. If you've tuned into this and you know who Josh Shapiro is before you tuned in, you're either a Pennsylvanian or a political nerd. And nothing against political nerds. I'm one of you. But it's just part of the challenge that you have when you're trying to introduce yourself to the American people. But on balance, when you're talking about the identity of a candidate, is he a man for the moment? It's not simply the case that you can say that people want anyone not named Donald Trump. That's not where the American people are. They're wanting a choice that they can feel unambiguously good about. And the debate performance, I think, robbed Biden of that message now and for the rest of the campaign. Here is a different candidate people can be voting for as opposed to purely voting against Donald Trump.
I'm Charles Blow, an opinion columnist at the New York Times. And while a lot of my colleagues are making the case for replacements for Joe Biden, I'm making the case that Joe Biden should not be forced off the ticket. I assume that most people who want to replace Joe Biden want the exact same thing that I want, which is to prevent Donald Trump from being reelected as president of the United States. If that is the goal, then you have to go with the person who has the best chance of defeating him. And I think that for right now, that person remains Joe Biden. There is no evidence that any of the other candidates who have been proposed as possible replacements for Joe Biden would do better than Joe Biden. There is no FDR, Barack Obama-like candidate waiting in the wings who everyone knows and who is going to galvanize the Democratic Party. The people in Louisiana do not know the governor of Michigan. The people in North Carolina do not know the governor of California. And we are saying that somehow in a broker convention at the end of the summer with only 3 months to go, you could put forth a virtually unknown person to the country, and that somehow that would be better than sticking with a person who we already know. In addition to that, a broker convention would mean that the voters would not have a say in who the candidate is. There would be no direct voting for the person that the Democrats put forward. These would be delegates. Some of them are elected officials. And I guess you could say that elected officials are kind of secondhand representatives of the people. So people did vote for the elected officials. And if they vote for the candidate, maybe that makes you feel a little bit better. But delegates are also party leaders. No one voted for these party leaders. These are just people who have participated in one favor and people like them. And those are the people who would pick the candidate. That is not democratic. That doesn't feel like the business that the Democratic Party would want to be in, which is having the candidate produced not by the voice of the people, but by the voice of the insiders. This has become an election about people who are for democracy and those who are not for it. It has nothing to do with the individual people and the individual characters and their individual competency. So I'm not trying to convince anyone that Biden is your best candidate. He's a fantastic person and, shooting on all cylinders and full of verve. I'm just saying that as it stands, he is likely your best option to prevent catastrophe. None of these candidates are people that I'm going to say, oh, I'm just jumping up and down because this person is so electric and magnetic. I'm simply saying, do you want to keep a country or not? Where is your best chances of keeping the country that you know and you love and that will have a chance to fight again one day with different candidates who may be younger, may be more of your taste? I am convinced that people are not scared enough yet. I don't think that people will be turning out for Biden. They'll be turning out against Donald Trump. I don't need a champion in the White House this cycle. What I need is someone to hold the White House and to hold the country in its current customs, in its current structure, so that the next cycle, maybe we have better options that we can be excited about. Joe Biden is already strapped to the rocket. At this point, he remains the best option.
Thanks for listening. We want to hear from you, too. How has your opinion of Biden, or Trump, changed since the debate? And what do you hope to see happen leading up to the Democratic convention? Share it with us in a voicemail by calling 212-556-7440 or email us at matterofopinion@nytimes.com, and we might just respond to your thoughts in an upcoming episode. To find more audio essays like this one, download the New York Times audio app and search for The Opinions. The New York Times audio app is free for Times subscribers. You can download it in the Apple App Store.